Hey there. So, what kind of stuff are you going to find in a book like Star Wars and Philosophy, that 2005 publication edited by Kevin Decker and Jason Eberl? Well, each chapter in the book is a single essay written by a different author. So, let's talk about that first essay in the book. So, for this video, I'm going to give a summary of the basic content and flow of the essay. I'm going to do a little bit of a review, talk about my reactions and thoughts, and how I feel about the series as a whole so far. So, this first essay in the book is actually written by Jason Eberl, who's one of the two editors who oversaw the book as a whole, and it's located within part one, which is the section that focuses on the philosophical messages of Star Wars. And chapter one is called You Cannot Escape Your Destiny, or Can You? Freedom and Predestination in the Skywalker Family. So, who's Jason Eberl? So it looks like he's a professor of healthcare ethics and philosophy at St. Louis University. And according to an article on the university website, Eberl has written over 65 articles and books on philosophical and bioethical issues, while Eberl's curriculum vitae includes traditional academic work in journals including the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, the American Journal of Bioethics, and the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. He has also published extensively for average readers, using science fiction to expose complicated ethical scenarios and metaphysical themes. These publications include The Philosophy of Christopher Nolan, The Ultimate Star Trek and Philosophy, and The Ultimate Star Wars and Philosophy, the last two with fellow SLU alumnus Kevin Decker, PhD. So, according to his faculty bio, Eberl received his MA in philosophy from Arizona State University and his PhD in philosophy from St. Louis University, and his research interests include beginning of life issues, end of life care, biotechnology and human enhancement, healthcare allocation, philosophy of human nature, and Thomism, or the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. So that's the guy. Now let's see how Dr. Eberl discusses freedom and predestination in the Skywalker family. So he starts off the essay by recalling the scene from The Phantom Menace, where Qui-Gon is saying in regard to Anakin, "He is the chosen one. You must see that." And then Yoda responds, "Clouded this boy's future is." So Eberl kind of expands on the various story features surrounding that, and then he ends up taking us to the scene near the end of that original saga, the original six-part saga, where the apparition of Obi-Wan tells Luke, "You cannot escape your destiny. You must face Darth Vader again." And Eberl says, "These scenes raise particularly interesting philosophical questions concerning freedom and moral responsibility." And then he goes on to list some specific questions about the nature and implications of predestination, prophecy, destiny, and fate, etc., that apply in the Star Wars universe. Now, I think the structure of the rest of the essay can be divided into a three-part progression. Those aren't the section headers that he uses, but I think it gives you a good idea of how the flow goes. So the way I see it, it seems like he starts off talking about free will and destiny and the nature of time. Then he transitions into free will and destiny and the idea of puppet masters or control, determinism, libertarianism, that kind of thing. And then he transitions into free will and destiny and motivation or desire, kind of a compatibilist Augustinian approach to free will. And then after that, he finishes off the essay with this really compelling final couple of paragraphs that just really pulls everything together and gives the reader some thought-provoking takeaways. So, first off, that first part, free will and destiny and the nature of time, he starts off the discussion there with the section header with that same quote from Yoda, "Clouded this boy's future is." And the idea here, as he starts off, the idea is that even though Qui-Gon thought he knew certain things about Anakin, and in fact the prophecy was technically accurate, but there was more uncertainty than he realized. And that's in a way kind of like how real life is too. The future is almost always kind of cloudy. But here's the question. Is the future truly, quote, indeterminate, undecided, quote, not set in stone? Or is it just kind of a point of view? So, as a postulate to help approach that question, Eberl brings up the God concept and the nature of time. So, the traditional concept of God as being outside of time, having the eternal perspective, seeing all frames of time at once. At location 277, I'm using the Kindle version, so I can't say page, I would have to say location. At location 277, Eberl says, "What would eternal existence, living outside of time, be like?" And at location 289, he explains, "From the eternal perspective, every moment in time occurs at once." And then as a ramification of that, he says, "Some philosophers would answer that Anakin does not freely choose to throw the Emperor down the second Death Star's reactor shaft. They assume that the eternal observer's knowledge determines his fate. Whatever has been correctly prophesied must happen." But, Eberl points out, the film does seem to really highlight Anakin's moral choice as a choice that he made at that particular moment. So how can we preserve free will? He suggests that one option would be what he calls countertemporal causality, the idea that a future choice causes past knowledge, whereas we typically think of past events causing future events. Though this wouldn't technically be countertemporal from the eternal observer's point of view, because from that point of view, all knowledge is simultaneous. And then he suggests another possibility. He says, thus far we have assumed an eternal observer and frames of time, but what if there is no eternal observer, and or the future isn't set because it doesn't yet exist? That's at location 323. All right, so those are some highlights from how he discusses free will and destiny and the nature of time. And then he kind of transitions into the part that I'm kind of calling free will and destiny and puppet masters or control or things like that. So he's going to talk about ideas like manipulation, influence, coercion, and then fatalistic determinism and libertarian free will. He starts with a section with the section header, "Everything is proceeding as I had foreseen," quoting the emperor. And he goes into a number of points in the story where the emperor seemed to see certain kinds of destiny, but at the same time, the emperor was making it a point to actively invest in trying to actualize the kind of future that he wanted. And then ultimately, at the end, he ends up being proven wrong about what he quote unquote foresaw because he's defeated. So the emperor kind of wants to be some kind of puppet master, and he actually has a tremendous amount of control and influence. But in the end, he can only go so far because the free will of individuals, such as Anakin, were really outside his control. Eberl suggests that this pulling of strings is similar to some views of God. In this kind of view, because God made us free, God ends up having, quote, about as much power over us as the emperor does over Luke and Vader. End quote. But whereas the emperor's inability to overpower free will is the limitation of him being a mere mortal, God's limitation is by choice. So Eberl says, God chose to create us with freedom of will, unlike droids or stormtroopers, and thereby elected to limit his own power to pull our strings. Though omnipotent, even God can't control us because of the way he created us. This allows us to be responsible for our moral choices and merit whatever reward or punishment we deserve. That's at location 357. So then he transitions to discussing ancient Sumerian and Greek ideas of fate and determinism. He raises the problem of future contingent propositions, citing Aristotle's maxim, either there will be a sea battle tomorrow or there won't. The idea is, if it's conceivable for somebody to make a statement about the future, does that imply that the future exists and therefore free will must be an illusion? So he expands on that, and then he provides two different resolutions to that problem. And then he transitions to defining and explaining libertarian free will and the idea of the power of contrary choice, which he kind of places in opposition to the idea of the will of the Force that Star Wars uses. So he cites a number of Star Wars references where people use the phrase the will of the Force almost as something that's kind of determining people's fates. So the opposite of libertarian free will. And then he cites Han Solo as an exception when Han says, "No mystical energy field controls my destiny." And then Leia later says to Luke, he's got to follow his own path. No one can choose it for him. So Eberl suggests Han, unlike Anakin and Luke, appears to have alternative possibilities in determining his own future, which most libertarian philosophers take to be fundamental to the definition of freedom. Location 402. And then the essay transitions into what I'm calling the third main part, free will and destiny and motivation or desire, kind of a compatibilist view. Really, the whole essay is just an expansion of the question of what is free will, but he started off focusing on the nature of time and then various ideas about determining factors or influencing factors or puppet masters. And now as he's coming toward the end, he's coming to focus on this sort of compatibilist, psychological, Augustinian kind of free will. So he cites John Locke's story of the man who willingly remains in a locked room that he couldn't escape if he wanted to because it's locked. So the idea of free will without compulsion, it really is his choice, but it's still without true possibility of him doing otherwise because he couldn't actually, the door's locked. He couldn't actually get out, but he doesn't want to. So Eberl concludes at location 414. He says, freedom then may ultimately depend upon a person's will, whether he desires to do one action or another, whether he desires to do good or evil, and his ability to do whatever he wills. And that's when he brings up Augustine's concept of desire as the source of our free choices. And he applies this to the fall of Anakin. He shows how the various steps in Anakin gradually becoming Darth Vader can be thought of as the outworking of what Augustine would call inordinate desires. He points out at location 426, even if something prevents Anakin from, say, marrying Padme on Naboo, imagine their ship blows up on the way there, he has already freely willed to violate the Jedi Code and is morally responsible for that volition. So, despite the appearance that Anakin has no alternative possibilities with regards to being the chosen one and destroying the Emperor, he's nonetheless free in choosing to ally himself with the dark side, because that choice stems from his own will, his own inordinate desires. Location 426. And so Eberl explains that throughout the saga, many different characters make an effort to try to influence Luke's will by making use of his desires, but, quote, ultimately, only Luke can turn his own will to the dark side. After all, as Augustine says, what cause of the will could there be except the will itself? Location 440. And then finally, Eberl closes out with a really thought-provoking final paragraph that takes all the concepts toward this kind of practical application, almost kind of a takeaway point. So I'll just read that whole final paragraph there. He says, in our own lives, it's important to ask which forces, quote unquote, are attempting to bend our will. What desires have the potential to become, quote unquote, inordinate and be allowed to take over our will? And we must also be conscious of the control we have over our own will and desires. Even if there's an eternal observer keeping watch over us or a puppet master pulling the universe's strings around us, we can pull our own strings and thereby determine what the eternal observer knows and limit what the puppet master can accomplish. We are radically free and thus responsible for what we choose to will. And then he says, and since my wife is still out with the girls, I think I'll exercise my radical freedom to watch Attack of the Clones and wake up the neighbors, comfortable in the knowledge that que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. All right, so that's how the chapter ends. So what are my thoughts about the chapter? Well, I think that this essay was really quite an intriguing and fun survey of the variety of basic ideas about the nature of determinism, free will, and fate. While it remained more or less surface level as kind of an introductory survey of the subjects, it definitely did a good job at weaving these philosophical categories in with the destiny-related themes of Star Wars. Now, some would probably feel that it gave insufficient space for more heavily deterministic perspectives. The author clearly leans toward a point of view that emphasizes the importance and reality of free will. And I think some would probably feel as well, maybe that it overused monotheistic concepts. For example, the extended discussion on the eternal observer as God, which is a pretty foreign concept to the pantheistic Star Wars universe. But neither of those really bother me a whole lot because even though they don't fit super well into Star Wars per se, the fact that they are an objectively prominent part of the landscape of philosophical thought regarding the topics of free will and destiny and stuff like that definitely makes them worth exploring. Now, you could say he spent a disproportionate amount of time on those viewpoints as opposed to other maybe more Eastern perspectives. But considering the fact that his research focus is the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas in particular, you could say he's really just focusing on his specialization, which is very much appropriate. And I assume as well, future chapters are probably going to spend a lot more time focusing on more Eastern religious ideas, particularly chapter 3, the far east of Star Wars. And when it comes to free will versus determinism, I think he did a pretty good job of representing the mix of concepts represented in the Star Wars films. The idea that both destiny and free will are actually emphasized in various lines of dialogue in the Star Wars films. And because of that, Eberl's compatibilist kind of conclusions near the end there, I don't think you can really see them as being heavy-handed or anything, but actually as being quite appropriate to the Star Wars universe itself. He points out, for example, how characters often speak as though they have no control, stuff like, oh, I can't help it, the Force is pushing me this way, or things like that, which he suggests maybe in some cases because those particular characters are so closely connected with the Force that they no longer have control, if it's a Jedi, for example. But maybe other characters such as Han, maybe they do have that kind of libertarian kind of control that others might not. And I kind of wonder if perhaps another possible interpretation in universe of that kind of thing might be that maybe some of those characters merely feel like they don't have a choice, but in fact they do. And I think Eberl was pointing toward that in other parts of the chapter. He's kind of got a diverse set of ideas he's representing and exploring and inviting you to explore. But anyway, regardless, I really appreciate the balance and care that the author here exercised in terms of, seems to me, carefully selecting various parts of the saga that reflect a nuanced balance between, let's say, fatalism and individualism, or between determinism and the power of free choice, etc., within the Star Wars saga. It seems to me that throughout the chapter, particular attention was paid to certain key points in episodes 1, 3, and 6 that serve sort of as pivot points explicitly connecting to the themes of destiny or free choice. So Anakin and Qui-Gon in episode 1, Anakin and Obi-Wan and the Emperor in episode 3, Luke in episode 5, Anakin and Luke and the Emperor in episode 6. It seems like these key highlight points ended up being the most referenced moments in the chapter, probably because they kind of represent the saga's integration points of the themes of destiny and decision making. Sort of like the saga's framework is held up by periodic key points that are referred to at various points as either determined by the Force or determined by something connected with the Force or something like that, or as being something that a key character needs to make a choice or a decision or to be influenced toward making a choice or something like that, such as Anakin making that final decision to throw the Emperor into the pit, which was effectively prophesied in Episode 1, which was what caused Qui-Gon back in Episode 1 to support and empower young Anakin with all the commitment and passion. But then Qui-Gon's faith, as it were, was returned with evil, as the Messiah turned out to be the Antichrist, as it were. Yet in the end, that prophecy turned out to always have been true. Hence the paradox of destiny and free choice. And I think Eberl is right that the films speak very vividly of both destiny and free choice. And I think this chapter here of Star Wars and Philosophy from 2005 does a really great job of exploring and introducing the various philosophical categories and questions that pertain to that can help us consider what it can mean to hold both sides of that paradox together at once. So, in conclusion, though the chapter does have a certain amount of dryness to it that probably won't appeal to all readers equally, I think if we think of this essay as a thought-provoking and fun-loving introduction to the topics of free will and destiny that uses Star Wars to engender interest in that topic, or if we think of it as aiming to use philosophy to empower the reader to engage better with Star Wars in a more intelligent and more cognitively engaged manner, I think either way, this chapter ends up being great fun to read and well worth picking up and giving a read. I hope you enjoyed this summary and review of Chapter 1 of Star Wars and Philosophy. If you want to see other videos that relate to sci-fi and fantasy, as well as stuff like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, make sure you hit that subscribe button. But have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.